This is what happens when you don't present in person in like 2.5 years. Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've never been to the Berkeley campus or Berkeley, California. It's quite nice here. You guys are all very lucky. Like Anna said, my name is Amber Reimondo. I direct the energy program for the Grand Canyon Trust. And again, our mission is to safeguard the Grand Canyon and Greater Colorado Plateau while supporting the rights of Native peoples. And just really quickly, a little like primer on where the Colorado Plateau is, because if you're like me, until you live there, you don't know what it is or where it is. And so the Colorado Plateau is a huge area. It straddles the parts of 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. It's home to kind of what a lot of people think of as like the Southwest national parks, national monuments. We have Arches, Canyonlands, Bryce, Grand Canyon National Park. And the Colorado Plateau is also home to 15 tribes. And the work that I do at the Trust in directing the energy program is that my team focuses on the impacts of hard rock mining, especially uranium mining, on Indigenous communities and also the environment, and also the broader question of how we mitigate climate change in a just way. So to mitigate climate change, we obviously must shift away from fossil fuels, but if we're not careful, that carbon-free energy future will come at the further expense of communities on the front lines of mining, processing, and hazardous waste disposal. The extraction industry has already left a legacy, especially on the Colorado Plateau, and they continue to leave a disproportionate negative impact on Indigenous and other communities of color. And I just thought it would be important to throw up this quote from Stephanie Malin in one of her more recent papers that she published in 2019. It says, hundreds of studies have now confirmed that patterns of environmental inequity exist and that poor marginalized peoples, particularly Indigenous communities and communities of color, are the most impacted by environmental risks and injustices originating in industrial extractive systems. These marginalized spaces often become environmental sacrifice zones where extractive industrial processes have left landscapes and people scarred. This is something that's already happened, and we really have an obligation to make sure that we don't shift to a quote clean energy future by just perpetuating these problems. So there's more than one pathway to net zero emissions. For many, including the Biden administration, new investments in nuclear power are part of the pathway that the United States is on. But nuclear power requires mining, processing, and eventual disposal of uranium, which is a radioactive element with a half-life in the billions of years. So that means that once we pull that uranium out of the ground where it's relatively stable, we have the responsibility to then protect people, the air they breathe, the water they drink from being contaminated by that uranium for the rest of human existence, like probably 4.5 billion years. It's a long time from now. And right now, the world lacks a safe long-term nuclear waste disposal strategy. And on top of that, there's the fact that mining and processing itself just disproportionately impacts communities and communities of color, especially Indigenous communities. And so the whole nuclear fuel cycle has a lot of challenges and problems. So the first challenge we face with the shift to carbon neutrality, toward carbon neutrality, has much to do with uranium. And on the Colorado Plateau, contamination from past uranium mining and processing already lingers. And again, this is especially true on Indigenous lands. On the Navajo Nation, for instance, there are more than 500 abandoned uranium mines that still haven't been cleaned up from uranium mining that happened in the 50s and 60s. And there's also contamination from past processing, so uranium milling operations all across the Colorado Plateau that are just going to be perpetual problems. Either groundwater contamination is technically impossible, or it's so expensive that the solution is to just pump groundwater in perpetuity to keep pollution plumes from expanding. So the threat of more uranium development in the name of expanded American nuclear energy really does loom large, especially for these communities that are already dealing with hazards from the nuclear fuel cycle. And then right next door to the Navajo Nation, we have the Grand Canyon. And there's a lot of interest in mining federally managed lands that are adjacent to Grand Canyon National Park. These lands are not only hydrologically connected to the Grand Canyon, but they're also part of the broader Grand Canyon region that is a great cultural and spiritual, it's of great cultural and spiritual significance to a number of tribes. And so just to orient you, the center where the river is, that's the Grand Canyon. There are the orange dots you see are mining claims that were staked between 2008 and 2012. On this map, there are over 8,000 of them. And by 2010, that number grew to 10,000. So you can see the interest in the region is high. The Grand Canyon region is the ancestral homeland of at least 11 indigenous tribes and nations, and many of those tribes have actively worked to stop the threat of new uranium mining in the region. This is not at all a precise depiction of relevance, but it's an approximation, or a couple of approximations. So uranium is a common element in the Earth's crust, but concentrated deposits that are actually attractive to mining companies form where natural conditions are no longer conducive to its mobility. So in the Grand Canyon region, there are different kinds of uranium deposits, but in the Grand Canyon region, uranium deposits are found in geologic features called breccia pipes, which are vertical geologic collapse features. You can see the illustration of one on the right there, that are made up of about 2,000 feet of broken rock. The deposits formed as trace amounts of uranium being carried through groundwater flowed down through that broken rock, and it reaches an area where there isn't any more oxygen available anymore, and so that causes the uranium and other minerals in the water to come out of solution and stick to the rock in that space. And so over thousands of years, those small amounts of uranium coming out of solution add up, and it becomes a more concentrated deposit of uranium ore. Again, that is relatively stable where it is because of the natural conditions that are present that cause them to form in the first place. Mining not only brings uranium ore to the surface where it's oxidized and then can be readily mobilized by wind or water, but it also introduces oxygen into the area where the deposit was taken, because it's not like drilling out a cavity where you mine it and suddenly there's no more mineralization. There's still going to be things like arsenic and uranium in that space. So when that happens, that means things like groundwater exposure from these mine shafts cutting hundreds of feet into the earth, that creates sort of a high stakes situation. Groundwater that's carrying elevated levels of uranium and other co-occurring elements like arsenic risk infiltrating groundwater aquifers both during mining operations and after mining operations. And that's key, because a mining operator can do everything, let's say that they do everything right while they're there. Water finds a way. And so after a mine is closed, and especially if there's not a long-term monitoring plan in place, then the risk of contamination is high. And this is particularly compounded around the Grand Canyon region, where the geology is very complex, it's highly fractured. We don't really understand exactly where groundwater flows, how long it takes to get from point A to point B, and we likely will never know, because this region is so vast and remote, and in order to understand groundwater flow in just one area, it requires deep groundwater monitoring wells, which are super expensive, and they usually run around $1 million to drill. So if you're talking about doing that all throughout the Grand Canyon region, that's somewhat unreasonable, and also it introduces its own risks, because if you're drilling wells, you're just creating conduits for contamination to travel that maybe weren't there before. So I want to talk about the health impacts of uranium really quickly, because I can't tell you the number of times that somebody from a mining company has held up a piece of ore and said, I could hold this next to my head for 10 minutes and nothing's going to happen. That's very different than radionuclides getting into your body, which is what happens if it gets into water that a person drinks, or if it's clinging to dust particles that a person inhales. Because once those radionuclides are inside the human body, they lodge there and emit gamma rays, which alters DNA and causes really horrible health problems like a variety of cancers and kidney failure. And I just threw up a couple of examples of how the Navajo Nation in particular has seen a disproportionate amount of health consequences that are consistent with uranium exposure as compared to Americans living elsewhere. Yeah, I think I just about that. And if you want a bigger picture of impacts on indigenous communities in the West, according to one estimate, 600,000 Native Americans live within 10 kilometers of an abandoned hard rock mine, which is not a small number. I just screenshotted this out of a paper. I hope nobody minded. I hope they don't mind. So as I mentioned, the Grand Canyon region is significant for at least 11 indigenous tribes and nations. The Havasupai tribe resides still within the walls of the canyon and has been at the forefront of the fight to stop uranium mining in this region. The tribe's village of Supai is located in a remote side canyon that is accessible only by a helicopter ride or a 10-mile hike or mule ride. So they're really far away from other resources. And the village's sole source of water and major economic driver, Havasu Creek, stems from spring flow that comes from the Red Wall Aquifer, which is a regional aquifer that underlies one existing mine on the canyon rim and then hundreds of other mining claims. So the threat to this community is serious if that groundwater aquifer is ever contaminated. The Havasupai tribe has opposed the canyon mine, which is the one mine that still exists. I think I've shown one picture of it so far, since it was approved in the 1980s. The mine is situated on the Kaibab National Forest. It's about 9 miles south of the south rim of Grand Canyon, and it sits within the Red Butte Traditional Cultural Property, which is a sacred site, a sacred landscape for the Havasupai tribe. And the photos that you see here are from their annual Red Butte gatherings. Before COVID, the Havasupai tribe would organize these gatherings, usually between August and September, and invite other tribes to come and help them speak out against the operation of Canyon Uranium Mine. It's been more than 30 years since Canyon Mine was first permitted, and it has yet to commercially produce ore. Its operator hopes that might change soon, but despite it not actually producing ore, it's already created a problem because they finished digging their 1,400-foot mine shaft in 2018, and they pierced an aquifer in doing that. And like we just discussed, there's groundwater now flowing into the mine shaft constantly that has to be consistently managed, which might be fine and well while they're there, but after closure, we'll see. And because of the 1872 mining law, hard rock mining, which includes uranium mining, is considered to be the highest and best use of the land, above all other uses, including cultural practices, recreation. And so short of a presidential declaration, say to declare a national monument, or an act of Congress to make a permanent mineral withdrawal, it's confusing, but a mineral withdrawal is a mining ban. It's nearly impossible for tribes or the public to have a say in where mining is and is not okay. So in 2012, tribes, in partnership with community members, elected officials, nonprofit organizations, including the Grand Canyon Trust, and others, succeeded in getting the Obama administration to declare a temporary 20-year mineral withdrawal / mining ban on uranium mining on about 1 million acres of Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands north and south of Grand Canyon. I have the outline is in the map I threw up earlier with the mining claims. We can go back to it if we need to. But for that ban to become permanent, requires an act of Congress. And so since 2019, we've been working to pass the Grand Canyon Protection Act, and that bill made it through the House several times, but keeps getting stalled in the Senate, so fingers crossed that we can get that over the finish line. In addition to mining on the Colorado Plateau, uranium milling and radioactive waste disposal also has a serious impact. I won't go into it, we can talk about it maybe during the discussion section, but the White Mesa Uranium Mill is a serious environmental justice threat to the Ute Mountain Ute community, which is just outside Bears Ears. And then there's, aside from nuclear energy, then we have renewable energy, and that comes with its own justice problems too, because all of these minerals are needed for renewable energy development. And so if we're going to get things like lithium and copper, I just pulled this from the International Energy Agency's website, but you can see kind of the relative amounts of these various minerals that are needed for different clean energy technologies. And again, the 1872 mining law governs how all of these minerals are extracted. And the need for minerals used to manufacture solar panels, batteries, and wind power is fueling policy right now, but if all we do is focus on mining more of those materials as quickly as possible without taking a more holistic view of material sourcing, then we're likely to worsen environmental injustices rather than ameliorate them in a so-called clean energy future. So from the nuclear fuel cycle to copper and lithium mining, Indigenous communities are at risk of yet again shouldering America's energy burden. And I just threw up a couple of more recent issues that have taken place or that are taking place in the West. There's a lithium mine proposal in Wyoming, one in Nevada, and, or sorry, not in Wyoming, in Arizona, one in Nevada, and then Oak Flat is also in Arizona. That's a copper mine. So really quickly, I don't have all the answers, but what we do know is that carbon reduction in and of itself is not good enough. If that's all we're working towards, then it means some will have to pay a higher price than others. And so emissions reductions have to be accompanied by a genuine effort to acknowledge and address the shortfalls in our current system. And so here are just a few suggestions that the Grand Canyon Trust has been pushing with policymakers. The first is to just reconsider investment in new nuclear power, no matter where you land, just proceeding with caution. So the trust right now has a policy of not supporting new investment in nuclear power. We're not married to that, but given the lingering legacy of uranium extraction, especially on the Colorado Plateau, same thing with uranium processing, and the lack of adequate long-term disposal strategies, and the fact that uranium ore, once it's extracted from its natural placement in nature, has to be managed and kept out of the human environment for billions of years, is right now a barrier to supporting further investment in new nuclear energy. And even if nuclear reactors technically are safer in that they are able to provide more time now in the case of like a power outage to restore power, as we've seen in Ukraine recently, there's nothing that can protect a nuclear power plant from something like war or some other serious disaster. So it's just proceed with caution. And then one thing that really needs to happen is that we need to reform the 1872 mining law. We need to allow for the public, and especially for tribes, to be able to have a say in where is and is not appropriate. And mining companies need to, at a bare minimum, pay royalties on the minerals that they're making a profit on. Right now, not only do they have the highest priority, but they also get to take it for free. And that's just a losing proposal in so many ways. The 1872 mining law has not been meaningfully reformed in 150 years. And when it was created, it was explicitly intended to encourage colonization. So it's far past time for that to be redone. And then another really important thing is that we need to be working on building a policy infrastructure around a circular renewable energy economy. So rather than saying in order to get all the minerals we need for renewable energy, we have to mine more. We should be mining where we have to mine in the right ways with reforming the 1872 law, but we also need to be being more efficient with the minerals we've already extracted from the earth and manufactured and put into products. So the EU's new battery rule is a good example of this, where we're just incentivizing and creating a system where it's easier for people to turn in their electric vehicle batteries, for instance, so that it can be turned into something else. So we're just being more efficient with what we've already taken out of the ground. And I'll leave it at that because I'm over by a little bit, so sorry about that.
Thank you so much for those wonderful insights, Amber. I'd now like to welcome our student moderator, Emma Tang, to the stage.
Hi, Amber. Thank you so much for your address, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And I'd like to remind the audience that if you think of a question for Amber, please save it for the end. We'll be having an audience Q&A then. So, Amber, for our first question, I'd like to ask you, as you mentioned in your speech, about the Grand Canyon Protection Act. So, as you mentioned, if passed, this act would make the ban on uranium mining in the Grand Canyon permanent. And so, what is the importance of passing the Protection Act to the trust?
Well, so like I said, because of the 1872 mining law, we don't have the ability otherwise to stop mines from happening in this region. And it's an incredibly important watershed on top of being an incredibly important landscape for so many Indigenous communities who have long opposed uranium mining. And so given the current structure, the current regulatory structure and statutory structure, the only option is to get a permanent mineral withdrawal. And it's been a long time coming. Tribes have been working on this particular effort since about 2008. And so it's long past due.
Would passing this ban have an impact on the trust's focus on getting these mining reform laws?
No, because the problem is broader. The Grand Canyon is a special case, but beyond that, there are mine proposals in Utah and New Mexico and places off the Colorado Plateau that people should be able to have a say in, and that mining companies should, at a bare minimum, be paying their fair share to operate.
Right. So, of course, environmental conservation is really, really complicated, and getting policy passed is hard. So I was wondering, in your time at the trust, which type of advocacy strategies have been effective and important to you in supporting implementation?
So we don't consider ourselves to be a grassroots organization, but in a lot of ways we do a lot of work with community members, especially at like the local elected official level, and I have found it to be really rewarding to work directly with tribal elected officials, and sometimes also community members, in advocating for things like the Grand Canyon Protection Act. We've had several fly-ins where we go into DC with a group of tribal representatives and sportsmen and businesses, and that sort of advocacy is really rewarding because you're talking directly to decision makers, with the people who are directly affected by the issue at hand.
Yeah, so going off of that, in your recent article about uranium mining, you mentioned that the 1872 mining law passed basically excluded lots of different types of people, such as women and Native Americans and Indigenous peoples, and they weren't able to vote on these laws. And so what is the legacy of exclusionary legislation in modern day lawmaking legislation?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think this is a broader problem than just the 1872 mining law, right? I mean, we, for so long, have formed policies and laws around what suits the person who stands to make money, which has often included mining companies and extraction. And I think like examples of that might be in the NEPA process. So we we all technically can participate in an environmental impact statement, say, where we can submit comments and offer our thoughts as individual citizens on a proposed mine or a proposed oil and gas project. But it's designed basically to benefit the developers still, because how many people work a full-time job, have families, don't have the resources necessarily or the time to educate themselves about all the intricacies of a project that might be right out their back door, to be able to raise relevant questions, or so it's built for the people trying to develop rather than people who are impacted by the development.
So you also mentioned that you work with policymakers, or you worked in the past with policymakers that may not have the same environmental issues at the top of your agenda. So how did you deal with that and kind of compromise with that through policy?
Well, it varies by issue, but oftentimes, I mean, the first thing you do when you're trying to work with somebody that you don't necessarily agree with is try to find common ground. And in those cases, a lot of times the common ground was economics and money. And so you go into the conversation knowing that the ultimate benefit is that, say, we're going to know what's in fracking fluid, but the way you present it is also about, you try to find a way to frame it around money, or like flaring. So a lot of oil and gas operations will flare leftover methane, so that it's because it's just a byproduct. It costs money for them to bring in the infrastructure to haul it away, but it is a marketable product. People buy natural gas, and so one of the co-benefits is that we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because methane is a major greenhouse gas, and we're improving air quality because it's not just methane coming out of the well, it's other things that can cause like ground level ozone and make people sick. But the conversation is around how much money the state can still make in things like royalties. So it's an imperfect conversation, but usually, and you don't always get everything you want, but reframing is maybe the best strategy.
Great. So the Grand Canyon Trust is a big pusher of like implementing clean energy, such as like solar and wind. So how has the Grand Canyon Trust sort of reframed, as you said, the issues of implementing clean energy from like an economic standpoint, or to make the policy more digestible?
Well, I think one way is just talking about the market. I mean, maybe 10 years ago or more, it was a harder case to make because coal-fired power was the cheapest power, but that's no longer the case. And so just talking about markets, the most wind and solar have caught up to fossil fuel versions of electricity generation. So that helps. Yeah.
So pivoting now to Indigenous populations and how uranium mining has impacted them. So as you mentioned in your speech, nuclear energy is often seen as a good transitionary energy, and also you mentioned like how material sourcing for other forms of clean energy, such as solar and wind, are important, but often these energies have, and the mining of the materials needed, have really big impacts on Indigenous populations. So given the persistent nature of Indigenous exploitation at the service of nuclear power and other forms of clean energy, and just economy in general, how, if at all, can nuclear power be reconciled with Indigenous rights?
I think at a bare minimum, the door truly has to be opened to Indigenous communities. So when there's a proposal, there can't just be a passive comment period opening, like we're proposing to revise these rules, or we're proposing this new uranium mine or this project, comment in the next 60 days. Like that's kind of sometimes the extent of outreach. What needs to be happening is direct outreach to the tribes and the communities that are involved. And sometimes that means repetitive outreach. People are busy, people have other things going on in their life. And so you can't just post something online and say, well, nobody said anything, so that we're gonna take silence as acceptance. And beyond that, oftentimes tribes get referred to as stakeholders, and they're more than that. They're sovereign nations. And so they're not the same as you or I as a citizen commenting on any of these projects or proposed rules, etc. They have a special status, and so they really deserve a seat at the decision-making table. And so whatever form that takes, if it's more Indigenous people in office, if it's more Indigenous people being appointed to or hired into decision-making regulatory agencies, I think all of that is cumulatively going to help.
Thank you. And also going off of that, you talked about how even a well-intentioned shift to clean energy can harm Indigenous populations who face the environmental burden of the energy industry. And how are Indigenous voices being meaningfully included in clean energy policy through the grant?
Well, so I guess one example is things like when we do go back to DC and we go with a group of community members who are directly impacted. We also like to just use our platform. It's not that big, but we have some platform to elevate voices of community members and Indigenous decision makers. So whether it's in press releases or through articles in our organization's magazine or blog posts or op-ed placements in local to national papers, doing things like that where we are not the only people speaking on the issue. I even considered tonight trying to see if there was a way to call in one of the partners that I work with, but I decided maybe that would be a step far. But yeah, things along those lines.
Yeah, so you mentioned that this issue is definitely something that's way bigger than just the Grand Canyon Trust or just embedded in the United States as well. And I was just wondering, energy policy is known to be pretty unstable. For instance, the Trump administration had different views than the administration before, and often environmental regulations are being rolled back or changing a lot. So how do you work to ensure persistent change despite the volatile nature of climate policy?
Yeah, that's something we think about a lot, and I think one way that we try to do that is by pushing for legislation where we can, because even if Congress flip-flops in terms of which party is in control, legislation is undeniably hard to pass. And so if you can get something over the finish line, it's much less likely, I think, knock on wood, that it's going to get reversed. The other thing is, I guess it's hard because sometimes you just have to do something that's an executive policy that could get flip-flopped in the next administration. But I think to some extent, there's a reality within the people who are career staff in these agencies who they're probably going to resist repeated flip-flopping if it's something that like a regulatory change or a rule change at the agency level. But yeah, it's really hard. I guess what we try to do is to try to rely on executive action as little as possible and try to get things done through the legislative branch, but sometimes executive action is required.
How does the trust do that? How do you keep yourself separate from, or as you said, rely on legislative action as little as possible?
Well, I mean, with the Grand Canyon Protection Act, we've been pushing this in earnest for this particular piece of legislation for the past two Congresses, and we will continue to do that until it's not possible anymore, until control of Congress flips. And so, yeah, I guess how we do it is we don't give up. We might be thinking about multiple avenues at once, but we're consistently pushing on the legislative button until it won't push anymore.
So if you are able to get the Grand Canyon Protection Act passed, like what are the, looking towards the future, what are the next steps for the Grand Canyon Trust, and what are your priorities going forward?
Well, one priority is a mine that is like mine I put up on the screen. Canyon Mine is technically within the withdrawal area, but it's exempt from the mineral withdrawal. It's been grandfathered in by the Forest Service, and that mine is a specific concern to the Havasupai tribe because what I mentioned, it being within the Red Butte Traditional Cultural Property, which is a sacred site for them, and also being above the aquifer that feeds their main source of water. And so we have been working to close that mine, and we'll continue to work to close that mine so that's sort of like a parallel but separate issue from the mining ban itself. And then we will be focusing a lot of time on sort of the things that I only gave short shrift to at the end, which are like building a circular renewable energy economy in the United States and working with decision makers to create that kind of infrastructure, because truly mining, just mining is not it's going to take away from the sustainability of renewable energy in the long run, not to mention the justice issues that it causes. So those are just two of the next steps, but there are plenty of issues, and I didn't really get into the White Mesa uranium mill, but that's another focus for the trust.
Yeah, could you speak more about circular renewable energy economy and kind of what that means and what it looks like in implementation? Yeah,
so I mean, in broad strokes, like right now, if you have, I don't know, let's say like a television, if you want to take, and maybe it's different in California. California is always a few steps ahead of the rest of us, but if you want to take your television to the dump, you have to pay to properly dispose of it. But what we would be encouraging in a circular economy at a much bigger scale is not only do we have proper ways of disposing of things or proper places where we want certain things to be taken, but we're going to incentivize you to do that. So we're not going to make it harder for you and more expensive for you to properly get rid of that electronic device or that battery. And then doing things like requiring manufacturers or making agreements with manufacturers to include a certain percentage of recycled minerals in their products going forward. So this started to happen with the Biden administration. I think it was Ford and another vehicle manufacturer agreed to include a certain percentage of recycled materials in their vehicles going forward. And so that then creates a market for the recycling to happen, which then incentivizes people to create recycling businesses. So that's sort of like a very basic explanation of what that might look like.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was my last question due to time, but yeah, thank you so much for answering my questions. And now I'd like to open up to the audience, and if you'd like to ask Amber any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing kind of your insights on how policy making can use as a tool for like creating change, but I'd also be curious in learning about like how people like us who aren't as heavily impacted by environmental injustice, how can we work towards like fighting for equitable distribution of resources for all these communities?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think one thing is just talking to your members of Congress and letting them know that this is important to you and that the impacts to these other communities are important to you. That I know that from experience, I know how that can feel unsatisfying because you just send an email or make a phone call, it just goes out the ether and you don't know if it makes an impact. But in my experience working with members of Congress, I think it truly does. And if they feel like they are backed by the people who vote for them back home, then that's gonna make an impact. So that's one thing. Another is doing things like donating to communities who, like community groups who might be established to work on these issues on behalf of the community. That money goes a long way when you're talking about like getting people back to DC or just feeding people so that they can have a meeting to strategize and discuss what to do next. Yeah, that's not a very exhaustive list, but
that's definitely helpful.
okay.
I think because oftentimes we think like all we can do is just read about these topics, but it's nice to know that we can even possibly do big changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question going based off of that. First of all, thank you so much for giving us this talk about like setting the standards for fighting environmental injustice and like elevating voices. It's definitely very important. And you mentioned that we have to, keep pushing the legislative button because it isn't going through. I wonder, I've heard of this sometimes in other policies that have been, especially in the past couple of years, published in the environmental space, but are there any sort of groups that you can partner with to push it forward even more? Because this is like the entire process is very impactful. So are there any organizations that you could work with or any other national parks that are doing similar things that you'd partner with to emphasize more what you're doing?
Yeah, we do this a little bit. Well, I shouldn't say a little bit. We do it a lot, but in different, on different issues and in different things. So with the Grand Canyon Protection Act specifically, we have a lot of partner organizations that work at the national level down to a more local level than the trust even, which is really helpful because everybody has a different expertise that they bring to the table, whether it's knowing community members or knowing members of Congress. And so with the Grand Canyon Protection Act, we partner a lot with other NGOs, and then also in the circular economy space, we partner with one regional, one national NGO, and I guess that's it so far. And then with like battery manufacturers. So via our national partners who actually know people who work in the battery recycling industry, we're able to bring those people into meetings with decision makers. That's an example. But yeah, partnerships are invaluable in this work because otherwise, I mean, there's just too much of it to do and you can't be an expert at everything. And so bringing people with relationships and people with technical knowledge and people with community knowledge all together really comes together for effective advocacy. And I didn't really talk about that when you asked about my favorite version of advocacy, but that's another reason why that sort of is important.
I think we have time for one more. Brendan.
Hi, okay, I had a quick question about, I know that a lot of this land is on like federal land, but it's crossing multiple state boundaries, and I was wondering in what ways have you and the trust seen like state laws come into play, or like if any?
Yeah, that is constantly coming up because obviously the boundary of the Colorado Plateau does not line up with jurisdictional boundaries of states. So oftentimes, if it's not a federal policy that we're trying to change, then you're going to each individual state. If it's something like oil and gas policy or but if it's like a specific project like the Canyon Mine, it's in Arizona. We work with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. So yeah, it's always a consideration. And as part of our climate work, when we started sort of shifting our view from just sort of like trying to shut down a coal mine and trying to have like a more measurable impact, we decided that we were going to do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the whole Colorado Plateau. And this came up a lot because we're like, do we measure within our like kind of arbitrary Colorado Plateau boundaries, or do we measure for the whole state of Utah, the whole state of Colorado, and the whole state of Arizona? Because jurisdictionally, like a state agency is not going to care that 6 counties in this southern Utah or whatever it is, emitted X number of tons of carbon in 2018. So it's always a challenge to figure out
the best angle given that our boundaries are sort of arbitrary.
Yeah, well, for the sake of time, that was the last question, but it was such a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for answering all of the questions. And I'm going to pass it back off to Lucy, but thank you.
You can go up there. So at every event, we like to give our speakers. Oh, wait for it to have the anticipation. Okay, at every event, we like to give our speakers a poster, and this event is no different. So if Anna would like to present this to you. This is from Ethan. He designed it from our communications team. So
Thank you so much.
of course. And a lot of work goes into all the events here at the forum. So I want to once again recognize our event manager, Anna, our communications lead, Ashley, our moderator, Emma, the poster maker, Ethan, and as well as our technology lead, Amanda. And our next event is with Warren Mosler, who is coming April 3rd at 1 p.m. So everybody, he's an economist and theorist. And thank you so much for coming, everybody. If you would like to, please use our feedback forum, which has our QR code and also tiny URL. And to stay in the loop about our future events, please like us on Facebook and feel free to visit our website. And with that, I'd like to wish everybody a nice evening and thank you so much for coming.